Surprised and unsurprised at a statement which is obviously contrary to the consensus reached between China and the U.S. in Washington not long ago. This is Chinese reaction of the White House's decision to put 25% tariffs on Chinese imports, which are worth $50 billion. China soon declared that it will defend its interests and called the U.S. mind-changing, a blow to and a squandering of its reputation. So why did the U.S. change course after the productive talks during Vice Premier Liu He's U.S. visit? Will it be the new norm for the U.S. to keep rescinding from its commitments? What is the thought process behind Trump's erratic decisions? And will this one be the final decision of the U.S.? To discuss those issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor John Gung from the University of International Business and Economics and Professor James Ray from California State University, Sacramento. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Pan Deng. So, gentlemen, let's start with the immediate reaction from China's Commerce Ministry. Surprised and unsurprised. What do you make of this unsurprised part, Professor?
Well, when we have seen this president, can switch position after writing a letter into the world, and
very formal letter
from the U.S. government, from the White House, and he rescinded his position the very next day or 2 days later. So this compared to his posture on the Korean issue, it's nothing. It's not a surprise at all. So I think it's it's just a very normal of this administration White House.
So you're saying that China is somehow ready for this sudden change?
I think that we understand very well that a lot of the details are still needs to be worked out. The agreement, the consensus agreement reached during Vice Premier Liu He's visit to Washington D.C. is really an overarching kind of a principal thing. A lot of details have to be worked out and up to negotiation. So I don't think that China is very surprised that U.S. is using this kind of a posture as a bargaining chip, as a negotiation tactic. And I think at the end of the day, I think everything's going to be worked out.
What do you make of this, Professor Ray? Do you think it's just simply a negotiating tactic?
I do. I don't think President Trump is a strategic thinker. He's a tactician and he's a fighter, and I think his background is business deals. And so I think in every meeting he's going to try to stake out a very hard line or a threatening position, and then when there's some concession he can claim victory to the American public. And so I anticipate this is going to be his mode on all these issues going forward. And I think it's not how diplomacy is done. It's going to be very challenging for other actors to adapt to this constant change and chaos that he seems to thrive in.
And let's get back to trade, Professor Gung. We know that a U.S. delegation right now is in China, comprised of about 50 officials from several departments, preparing for Secretary Wilbur Ross's Beijing visit coming up at June the 2nd. So, having witnessed these sudden changes, U-turn of events in recent days, do you think that the upcoming round of talks will happen?
Oh, definitely. I think definitely Wilbur Ross is going to come here on Saturday, and I think he said that it's going to be. He said that these tariffs will be imposed and be announced on June 15th. So it still hasn't been announced yet officially. So it will be announced. So I think it is still very much.
So it's not a sure thing about the latest change.
I doubt it's going to be a sure thing. I think that it's still up to negotiation. I mean, everything is up to negotiation. Many lawsuits are settled on courthouse steps right before the court hearing. So I'm not surprised that these things will be negotiated over and over up until the 11th hour. So I think it meant to strengthen the U.S. negotiation position to help with Wilbur Ross' Beijing visit. But I think there's another thing going on is that there is some resistance in the Senate and the Congress as well regarding Donald Trump's dealing with China. So, for example, on the issue of ZTE, for example, right? And Florida Senator Marco Rubio has introduced a new bill, So all these things also play towards his decision to sort of play hardball right now.
So talking about divisions, you mentioned division within Trump's own trade team, Professor Ray.
Well, I think there are strong voices traditionally in the Republican Party in favor of free trade. Some of those key advisors resigned several months ago when this trade war commenced. And so I think we're left primarily with a more protectionist team that has a more skeptical view of China and China's model of economic development. And so I think President Trump sometimes is listening to these more hardline voices, and he has lost a lot of the moderating voices. And then, as mentioned,
Hardline voices from whom?
People like Wilbur Ross and Peter Navarro, who are
Lighthizer, Rob Lighthizer.
Yeah,
these are.
Yeah, I mean, this is the team.
Yeah, you know, Lighthizer used to be the major guy in dealing with Japan. I think in the 1980s, the trade representative dealing with Japan in the 1980s. I mean, in a way, he succeeded in pressuring Japan to open up the market and to cut back Japanese exports of automobiles to the U.S. So I think he's probably using the same kind of tactics this time again. But today it's a very different situation. You know, China's not like Japan. You know, it's an independent country, and the economic interactions between the two countries is really intertwined. I mean, there's a huge business interest here in China by corporate America. It's something like $400 to $500 billion industry here in China. You know, Apple sold 51 iPhones here in China. Starbucks is doing very well in China. GM sold more cars in China than in the U.S. And all these things are not reflecting the trade statistics, you know. But these are all American interests. So,
but having said that, you gentlemen just mentioned that there are maybe more hardliners than ever in the decision-making circle. So, do you think China is ready to deal with this new momentum from the U.S., Professor Ray?
I think it's taken some time because from President Obama to President Bush and before, there's been a consensus in the U.S. in favor of free trade, disagreeing whether it should be multilateral or bilateral. But this is so radically new. In fact, the first year of office, President Trump kept that consensus, but now he's taken this other approach toward NAFTA, toward free trade, to the TPP, to the WTO, and now directly with China. And so I think it's so out of interest for the U.S. to be pursuing this hard line, and particularly because the economic relationship between the U.S. and China is what alleviates the tensions and the security relationship and the other tensions. And if the economic relationship breaks down, then we're in, you know, real a tense moment here between these two significant economies.
And earlier we mentioned the immediate response from China's Commerce Ministry, and on Thursday morning, the Commerce Ministry also said that China's door to negotiations would always be open. What do you make of this statement?
Yeah, I think it's a more measured response. I think you know, the Chinese side understands very well that these things will be negotiated over. It's more of a tactical play on his side. So I think, you know, we shouldn't really make too much of a you know, this statement. I mean, Donald Trump makes a lot of statements, contradictory statements on tweet, on you know, official White House releases, on press releases, all kinds of things. So, you know, I would say, you know, take these messages with a grain of salt and stick to the negotiations, stick to where the real interests are between our two countries.
So let's get back to real deeds, as you just mentioned. What would be the focus of the current preparation and the upcoming round of talks between the two countries?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things on the table that China are ready to do. One thing, for example, to lower the tariffs. We're already doing this. We've just announced that tariffs will be reduced on a lot of commodities and goods. The second thing is, I think we're going to, I think China side is going to negotiate with you with a long-term contract about importing some, you know, hundreds of billions of American goods, especially in the energy side, on the oil and gas, on the LNG side. Right now, you know, the U.S. exports of LNG products to China is really constrained by the port facility, storage facility. I think within a year or two, 3 more facilities will be coming over to full capacity, and there will be a lot of imports of that. I think this is one angle that China can make a promise to the U.S. to help alleviating this, you know, trading balance. And I think in other areas, for example, you know, China is going to increase a lot more imports in areas of medical products and maybe even automobiles. You know, who knows? Airplanes as well.
You just mentioned China's lowering of import tariffs on many goods. Actually, many of these decisions were made several years ago by China's top leadership. So, Professor Ray, do you think U.S. President Donald Trump is somehow bandwagoning on China's strategic decision and makes it look like it's coming from his pressure?
Well, I think we're heading toward a midterm election this fall, so I think these tactics will escalate, and then ultimately the election of the president in 2 years. And this plays well in the American public, protecting American industries from perceived national security threats if a Chinese corporation were to invest in an American entity, and then pushing American exports on China, and China acquiesced to those demands and would lower the trade deficit. And so I had expected after the last concessions China made, we would move forward in a positive way, but I think the Trump team will continue to play this card, certainly because his popularity is not so high right now. His party is expected to lose the elections, and this pulls Democratic voters because the unions and manufacturing feel vulnerable to pressures from China. So I do think this will continue.
So are you also saying that somehow the current tensions will ease after the midterm election in the U.S.?
I think around that time, Trump can say, look, China has done all of these things because of my pressure, and now we're going to have a strong economy, the trade deficit will shrink, and then after that election, I think it would be moving forward to back to kind of the status quo and so forth. That presumes that team is committed to practical politics, but I think there is a bit of an ideological message here of these protectionists that might see China, they've produced reports suggesting China is a threat economically, militarily, and so that they may continue to push a hard line in a few areas.
Yes, Professor.
I think it's more than just a trade issue. I mean, from the U.S. side, it's very clear. If you read the Section 301 report carefully.
That's domestic law, right?
Yes, it invokes a old clause in the U.S. Trade Act. But the point is that what the Section 301 report points to is more than just a trade issue. It looks at a lot of those, what they describe as distortionary trade practices. It's really about so-called China's industrial policy, China's state-owned enterprise issue, state aid, alleged China's government's organized effort to acquire foreign companies, which I don't think is really true.
That's more about strategy and decision-making, policy-making. We'll be talking about later in this program.
Okay.
But when we talk about trade, we need to get back to technicalities. So what do you make of the nature of the current U.S.-China trade row? Is it a structural problem between the two countries?
I think the fundamental issue of trade deficits related to U.S. fiscal deficit. We have this twin deficit problem in this for a long time, given that U.S. currency is a world currency. So it's not surprising that we're going to have some trade surplus with the U.S. If it's not China having trade surplus with the U.S., it's got to be somebody else. So this is a structural problem, not just a specific problem between China and U.S. But I granted the number is pretty large though. We're talking about over $300 billion of trade surplus on China side. This number is not sustainable, in my opinion, both politically as well as economically. But look at the trade pattern itself. The two economies are fundamentally very complementary towards each other. China's manufacturing is very efficient. U.S. has great agricultural products and energy products, high-end and high-tech products. So the complementarity between the trade is perfect in my opinion. And I think besides that, there are really sort of no fundamental conflicts of interest in many things, other than maybe Taiwan issue is probably the only stumbling block. Even that issue, I think, is importance of that is sort of fading away. Modern military technology is rendering it more and more relevant. But other than that, there are really no. I don't know if you agree with that, James. There are really no fundamental conflict of interest. Two economies are complementary towards each other, and the trade reflects that pattern. Corporate America is doing great in China, and it should be a good picture for both countries.
So what do you make of the nature of the current trade row?
Well, I agree with Professor Zhong that these are complementary economies, but I believe that this Trump team is very sensitive to the trade deficit, very sensitive to the U.S. debt and the possession of $1 trillion of U.S. treasuries in China, very sensitive to a competition that is perceived to be losing on the American side because of America's limited infrastructure. America's manufacturing is hollowed out. And again, that's a structural problem. American manufacturing is not coming back to the U.S. as much as President Trump would like to try, but it may go to Vietnam or India or Mexico or elsewhere.
But did he find a right way to correct those structural problems within the U.S. economy? Well, besides finger pointing to China.
If he had fully committed to his infrastructure plan that was supposed to be this year of a $1 trillion investment plan, he's doing nothing domestically because he's limited politically. So I think foreign policy is the one area he can act. He has advisors that think by talking tough to China, he'll win some concessions that he can show to America and to North Korea. He's banking his whole, I think, re-election that he's going to bring peace to the Korean Peninsula. So he's taking a lot of risks. I think that fits his view and then his advisors' view that this is the way to rebuild America, but they're doing nothing on the domestic side, just focus on other countries, and not just China, most other allies as well.
Right, gentlemen, we'll be continuing this after a short break. You're watching Dialogue on CGTN. Stay with us. So, gentlemen, earlier we talked a lot about technicalities in dealing with trade, but what about issues on a strategic level? Earlier you mentioned U.S. concern on China's industrial policy. Could you be more specific on that?
Yeah, well, I think the real concern from the U.S. side is that they're seeing corporate China and China in general is very fast ascendance in innovation and technological capabilities in a range of fields. For example, in solar power, in energy, in flat display, in electric vehicles, UAV, all range of technologies. Corporate China is rapidly catching up, and I think the U.S. is climbing on the wrong tree by thinking that the reason behind these innovation ascendance is because of China's government's industrial policy, which in my opinion cannot be further from the truth. I mean, look at the great companies that are competing effectively on global stage. Many of them are not state-owned companies. They're private companies, and they don't have much to do with China's industrial policy, nor have they received a lot of government subsidies. Their innovation is mostly indigenous. Companies like Sany Heavy Industries, for example, Haier, Huawei, Lenovo. These great companies, the crown on the jewel, a jewel on the crown of corporate China's technological capabilities. These companies are indigenous companies. I mean, they don't receive a lot of state aid from the government. So, by attributing success of these companies to a wrong reason, in my opinion, they're climbing the wrong tree. I mean, I think U.S. would be better off by investing their own companies, investing their own technological capabilities, and cooperate with corporate China in sort of approaching the world global market. Instead of just competing, and there's also a cooperation aspect of it, and I think that is the right approach. Instead of sort of taking a confrontational approach and chasing something that's not existent.
Is it because the U.S. feels threatened by China's industrial and technological advancement, Professor Ray?
I think because, American, in my view, educational K-12 is weak. American human resources are vulnerable. America's infrastructure is quite aged. And to witness not only China, but Korea, Japan, most of East Asia advancing so rapidly with a model in all three cases where the government does provide incentives with plans, with strategies, with industrial policy. And of course the U.S., that's all left to private banks to determine. A lot of those companies choose to move overseas. And so President Trump has tried to find a way to cajole or pressure those companies to find themselves more pro-American when they're really globally profit-driven. And so I think, where China has 5-year plans and 20-year plans and even 40-year plans, the U.S. doesn't have more than a 1-year plan. And I think that's the systemic dilemma for the U.S. to be competitive going forward. Of course, it has Silicon Valley and innovative companies, and China's not simply state-owned companies, but I think a master plan that determines which companies, like in Korea and Japan as well, which companies will have preferences, which will be world leaders. And I think the U.S. has a disadvantage, and it's really a contest of these two competing models of capitalism.
And do you think that that's the reason also leads to another part in Trump's latest announcement regarding trade with China, besides the tariff increase we just mentioned? He also said visa restrictions on Chinese students studying particular majors, especially technological and industrial-wise, will be imposed. What do you make of this?
I think he might as well do such crazy things, and this is totally stupid. I mean, this is I've never seen.
Do you think he's basically saying that you cannot gain technological advancement until I grant you?
Well, I mean, he's using a 18th century tactic to deal with a 21st century problem. You can't stop the flow of knowledge, in this age and day. It's just impossible. By limiting, students from China to study in the U.S. in these fields, it's not going to succeed. I mean, students will go to, universities in UK and other places, in Canada, for example, in other places, and this kind of a exchange of knowledge is not going to stop. It's not going to succeed. I think this is a totally, stupid.
You say it's exchange of knowledge. Some U.S. politicians say it's China stealing U.S. technology. What do you make of this, Professor?
Well, I mean, for Trump's perspective, as a nativist, as a nationalist, we could see in engineering and science, 70% of American graduate students, PhD students, are not U.S. citizens. They're not U.S. born. They're from India. They're from China. They're from Europe. And they come to Silicon Valley. They come to Stanford. They come to Silicon Valley. They drive American innovation. So if America shuts off the immigration of especially high-skilled labor, it's going to defeat and take away the advantage America has of these wonderful universities, and it'll dry up the innovation. Because the innovation is not so often Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg and some homegrown talent. It's often overseas talent. And so I think the competition it's a global economy, and trying to apply a protectionist model in all facets of immigration policy, trade policy, fighting currency battles is understandable because it plays to the American public's insecurity, but it is not viable for a global competition.
It runs everything against what America stands for, right? I mean, this is not America is all about. It's a
So you think it's more than the lack of a strategy? It's about the fundamental national interest of the U.S. itself?
It seems to be more like knee-jerk reactions. I mean, it's not a systematic approach. It's somehow sort of improvised, and I mean, so many companies, wonderful companies in the U.S. are founded by immigrants, are founded by people you're talking about, come to the U.S. to receive, higher education and be innovative and start a business and create jobs and stimulate growth. If U.S. is not going to accept students, even though he's doing this, I think domestic universities in China also catch up very fast. Universities like Beijing University, Tsinghua University, they are also investing making huge amount of investment into these cutting-edge science and technologies. And students from all over the world are going to go to these universities. America is going to lose edge by doing something crazy as this.
And also, do you think, Professor Ray, the United States national strategy, as President Trump puts it has long been too predictable?
Well, I mean, there is the legitimate problem in America of America's working class losing jobs, income inequality is growing, and so this is the attempt to rectify some of these changes, but it's a model that's not going to work in the 21st, 22nd centuries. But I think that's the audience President Trump is playing to in the United States. Those are people who don't travel overseas, who are not working for major corporations, who don't speak foreign languages, who often don't come from international backgrounds. And that's his constituency, and he has some personal sympathy, I think, to this kind of viewpoint. And it appears, I think these are his preferences, but he used to have advisors discouraging this kind of approach because the consensus in America is the future is global, is international, is connecting to the world, and the American ideology is that. But there are voices that are left out in that equation.
So do you think the United States will come up with some constructive approaches on the strategic level to deal with this problem?
I don't. I think, it's what Hillary Clinton said. There are those who are on the coast who are connected to the globe, and then there are those in the interior of the United States who are disconnected. And America's changing demographically, ethnically. There are those who will be left behind. and how to keep them committed to the path of the nation. America doesn't have the ability to really pull a grand strategy and have the public kind of latch on. It's very divided politically right now. It's very divided. It's going to become more divided as demographics change over the next 20 years. And frankly speaking, the white population will no longer be the majority population in the United States in about 20 years. There's going to be a lot of tensions that we're already seeing because of that factor. There is a sort of national crisis, and I think the Trump nativist position reflects that. But it's only going to accelerate. It's only going to grow this kind of fear that I think exists.
Having said that, the United States is still the largest economy in the world and the only superpower on this planet. So do you think that possible momentum you just mentioned will bring more fundamental changes to the current international order?
I think, for many countries, it's a welcome change to have China playing a role through the Belt and Road Initiative and the Silk Road and the AIIB. And I think the Europeans are interested, and many countries chose to join the AIIB. I think that's, if there is a new model that President Xi Jinping has offered that will be win-win, and it's focused on trade and its respect for country sovereignty, I do think that is a viable model. I think America is not going to be able to sustain global leadership simply by spending on the military. It's going to have to invest domestically and make sure the universities are attractive and make sure it's still a global economy. And so I think these are challenges, but there's no consensus in the U.S. about global leadership. And if there's no consensus, it will be hard to be a global leader.
How do you think China should position itself in this changing moment?
I think China should stick with its current course. China should keep playing a more active role in the world, in the leadership of the world governance aspect of things, actively participating in international institutions and organizations. In a way, I think it's actually quite sad that the U.S. is somehow sort of abandoning the very institutions and very
created after the Second World War.
Right, it created, and used this remarkable power to keep this way, to keep world's peace and prosperity for the better part of the last 70 years. Now it's sort of taking a back seat. It's picking up things that he likes and abandoning things he doesn't like, and this creates tension. It creates tension with its U.S. allies in Europe. It creates tensions with its allies in Asia, and also creates a problem when China sort of step into the space and play a more active role. So this is a kind of a convoluted picture. I don't know very well how it will be sorted out. For example, they're arguing about things that the U.S. basically is pulling out, and it's also obstructing nominees of key members of some panels. On other sides, it's actually using the WTO dispute settlement mechanism to advocate advance its own interests. So it's doing two things at the same time. And I think in this way, the credibility of WTO is going to be in question. Other countries will take a look at this situation and see, look, what's the mandate here? What's the authority here, right? So
many would be in question. For example, Professor Ray, very quickly, do you think Trump's unpredictability will be a new norm in U.S. diplomacy?
I hope not. But we could have further presidents elected who speak this populist message and who actually have a more varied background, a skillful ability. And so I'm afraid that this could be more common. As I said, there is a core demographic that would vote for this kind of message. There is, the pathway of the WTO is not popular in the United States, but is the 20 years of effort to pull China into this international order, and China has been participating and moving toward being a stakeholder in that system, and now they're pulling the plug on trade, on these institutions. So I think I would not be surprised if this continues in the next election, even if it's a new president.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. And that's it for this edition of Dialogue on CGTN. I'm Pan Deng in Beijing. Bye-bye.
Okay, good. Thank you very much.